You'll never amount to anything." They laughed over dinner, mouths full of roast and red wine, their voices carrying the careless cruelty of people who mistake familiarity for permission. It was my mother who said it first, her smile tight and knowing, like she'd already made peace with my mediocrity. My brother followed, chuckling with the kind of confidence only a man who's never been underestimated can afford. I sat there in silence, my hands folded in my lap like I had learned to do as a child. Always the quiet one, the odd one, the dreamer. Always the disappointment. They mocked the way I spent my days, poring over maps and strategy books, practicing my speech in front of a mirror, polishing my boots until they reflected the ceiling. I'd told them more than once what I was working toward, but they'd stopped listening a long time ago. I wasn't surprised by their laughter. What surprised me was how little it stung. Maybe I'd grown numb. Or maybe, finally, I had something stronger in my veins than the ache for their approval. The next morning, the house was still draped in the sleepy hush of early light when the knock came. 3 sharp raps on the front door. My father, bleary-eyed and unshaven, opened it in his bathrobe. And there he stood, General McAllister. Full uniform, crisp salute, voice like thunder cracking across a parade field. "Good morning, Colonel," he said, his eyes on me. They dropped their forks. My mother's face drained of color, the wine glass slipping slightly in her fingers. My brother, still in his t-shirt from the night before, blinked, trying to reconcile the world he thought he knew with the one now standing in front of him. And me? I just stood taller. Because while they'd been busy laughing, I had been building. Quietly, diligently. I'd risen through the ranks not with fanfare, but with focus. I took every doubt they tossed at me and forged it into discipline. Every insult became fuel. They didn't see the long nights, the cold mornings, the bruises and blisters. They didn't see the sacrifices, the tenacity, the unwavering resolve. And they certainly didn't see me. Until now. Now they saw the uniform, the salute, the respect. But they still didn't understand the cost. That morning changed everything. But not in the way they thought. Because this isn't a story about proving them wrong. It's about finally seeing myself clearly to why father tried to recover first. He straightened, forced a laugh, and reached out a hand as if this could be just another surprise in a long line of family milestones. "Well, look at you," he said, his voice catching slightly. "Didn't know you'd gone and made Colonel." But I could see it in his eyes, the timeline scrambling behind his pupils, trying to remember the last time he'd asked me anything real. When he cared to notice the sharpness in my tone, the hours I kept, the way I stood with my shoulders square like I was carrying something heavier than groceries and silence. I didn't take his hand. The general spoke again, politely, professionally, with the tone of someone who knew I deserved more than familial pageantry. He congratulated me on the promotion, said I had earned every stripe with distinction, and offered to escort me to the base for the formal pinning ceremony. The details were secondary. What mattered was the reverence in his voice. The contrast. The reverence they had never bothered to give. As I turned to gather my things, I caught my mother's whisper. We had no idea. Her voice was soft, almost sorrowful. But it wasn't an apology. It was a defense. A retreat. No idea. That was the story of my life in this house. No idea I stayed up through the night for my first training exam, that I vomited from nerves and still ran the obstacle course at dawn. No idea I'd been published in military journals, had my strategy simulations taught in 2 officer schools. No idea I was capable of being more than their footnote, their cautionary tale. I walked through the living room like it was a battlefield I'd already conquered. The photo wall, still filled with my brother's baseball trophies and their wedding portrait, blurred in my periphery. My own framed certificate, the one I'd mailed them 5 years ago, sat dusty and slightly crooked on the far corner table, half hidden behind a lamp. They didn't see me then. And now, they only saw the surface. Outside, the general opened the car door for me. I stepped in without looking back. The neighborhood was quiet, the air still. But inside me, there was a reckoning beginning to bloom. Not loud, not vengeful, just certain. I didn't need them to grovel. I didn't need their approval. I needed to write the next part of my life on my terms. This was just the beginning. The ride to base was silent at first, the kind of silence thick with meaning, respect, reflection, restraint. General McAllister glanced at me once, offered a nod that felt like permission not to speak. I appreciated that more than words. Words had always been used against me back home, twisted into lectures, jokes, dismissals. We drove past the elementary school where I first learned to march, in a way. Not in formation, not in uniform, but with my head down, moving to the rhythm of avoidance. That was where I first understood what it meant to disappear even while being present. I remember standing on that playground watching other girls giggle in clusters, their braids bouncing as they skipped rope. I remember clutching my notebook, filled with stories I never read aloud, and wondering what it would take to be seen without having to shout. At home, the rules were simple: speak when spoken to, and even then, make it brief. My brother could rant about football plays and late-night parties. My father would laugh, slap him on the back, call him my boy. But if I tried to explain anything, why I liked history, why strategy fascinated me, why I wanted to join the ROTC, I'd be met with silence or worse, the long sigh of disappointment. You need to be realistic, my mother would say, slicing carrots like she was trimming back my future. Girls like you don't do things like that. Girls like me. It was never clear what that meant. Too quiet, too sharp, too strange, too determined. In college, I'd started keeping a separate journal, a kind of survival manifesto. I wrote down every small victory, every obstacle passed, every moment I wanted to share with them but knew I couldn't. That journal became my mirror, the only place where I could see myself whole. I thought about burning it once, the night after they forgot my officer school graduation. Not a text, not a call, nothing. My roommate's parents flew in from 3 states away and cried through the ceremony. Mine didn't remember the date. But I didn't burn it. I knew, somehow, I'd need those pages one day to remind myself this was real, that I wasn't just imagining the weight of my own footsteps. Now, as the base gates opened and the guards saluted, I felt a flicker of something close to pride, but softer, sadder. Like watching the sun rise over a battlefield still littered with your own broken armor. I was being honored today, but no medal could unteach what the house I grew up in tried to drill into me, that unless I mirrored them, I was worthless. I wasn't angry anymore, just awake. And with every breath, more myself. The ceremony was held in a modest hall on base, nothing grand, just polished floors, a few flags, and chairs neatly arranged in rows. My name echoed through the space as the citation was read aloud, every syllable crisp, reverent, confirming that I belonged here. Colonel Olivia Carter. Even now, I can hardly write it without emotion catching in my throat. Not because I doubted I could reach this point, but because I had spent so long being told, in subtle and not-so-subtle ways, that I never would. I stood straight as the general pinned the silver eagle to my lapel. The metal was cold, but the heat in my chest made it feel like fire righteous earned. Applause followed, of course. My colleagues rose, clapped, some even whistled. But I didn't hear them. What I heard was my father, years ago, muttering at the dinner table, "You're just doing this for attention." What I heard was my mother saying, "Don't embarrass yourself. You're not strong like those other girls." What I heard was silence on my promotion to major. Silence on my first command. Silence when I deployed. Silence when I returned. They hadn't even asked if I came back whole. The general spoke briefly afterward, praising my leadership, my tactical brilliance during the Arctic training exercises, my unwavering commitment to those under my command. He didn't know that those traits were forged not just in boot camp, but around a dinner table where I learned to command my emotions, strategize my words, and lead myself through the minefield of invisibility. When he finished, I turned to address the room. My speech was short. I didn't need to say much. I thanked my team, my mentors, and my fellow officers. Then I paused. I looked into the crowd, where one seat in the front row remained empty. Reserved for next of kin, they said. I left it vacant. I was once told I'd never amount to anything, I said, my voice steady. But I chose to listen to something deeper than doubt. I chose my own voice. And she's never steered me wrong. That was all. No revenge. No bitterness. Just truth. After the ceremony, while the others mingled and clapped each other's backs, I stepped outside into the brisk air. The sky was that perfect kind of overcast, just enough light to see, just enough gray to feel like anything could happen. I pulled out my phone. 3 missed calls from my father. 2 from my mother. A text from my brother. Didn't know you were actually doing all that. Congrats, I guess. No emojis. No sincerity. Just confusion wrapped in condescension. I didn't reply. I opened a blank message, stared at the screen for a moment, then typed a single line. Colonel Carter. That's who I am now. Not that it matters to you. Then I deleted it. They didn't deserve that piece of me. That evening, I sat alone in my quarters with a glass of bourbon and a silence I hadn't known in years. Not the heavy kind I'd grown up with, the silence of being dismissed, overlooked, gently ignored, but a calm, grounding quiet. The kind you earn. The kind that comes after a storm. I opened the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a letter I'd written years ago, folded and refolded so many times its creases had become scars across the paper. It began simply, "Dear Mom and Dad." I had written it during my first deployment, after my unit barely made it out of a near-fatal engagement. We lost 2 good men. I remember sitting under a tattered canopy of stars that night, hands shaking, heart too full of grief and adrenaline to sleep. That was the night I realized I might die before they ever knew who I really was. I had tried, in that letter, to explain myself, to tell them about the woman I was becoming, to ask why it had been so hard for them to see me, truly see me, as worthy. I never sent it. Not out of fear, but because some truths don't fit into envelopes. Some truths demand a different kind of delivery. So I kept that letter, added to it over the years. Lines scrawled in different inks from different places. Notes in the margins. Confessions I'd never spoken aloud. It had grown into a patchwork of pain and clarity, the map of a daughter navigating the territory of emotional exile. I ran my fingers over the words now, part of me aching, part of me proud. They would never read this letter. And that was okay, because it wasn't for them anymore. It was for me. I folded it carefully, slid it back into its envelope, and tucked it into a fireproof box alongside my medals and my grandfather's watch. The things that mattered. The things I earned. My phone buzzed again. A voicemail from my mother this time. "Sweetheart," she began, her voice all soft edges and performance. "We saw the article online. The promotion. We're proud of you. Call us back." Proud. What a strange word, coming from her lips. I didn't call back. Instead, I opened the news article they were referring to. There I was, standing tall in my uniform, the silver eagle gleaming, the headline reading, "Boston native Olivia Carter becomes youngest female colonel in unit history." Below the article, comments had already started to flood in. One caught my eye. "I served under her. She saved our lives. She doesn't just lead, she listens." Another, "About time the world saw her the way we do." And another, from a name I didn't recognize, "She grew up in our neighborhood. They always underestimated her. Not anymore." I felt a smile tug at the corner of my mouth. Recognition, once denied, had found its way to me not through blood, but through bond. Through those I'd led, those who'd seen me fight for every inch of ground I now stood on. That night, I slept without dreaming. Because for once, I didn't need to imagine being seen. I already was 0.2 days after the ceremony. I returned home. Not the house I'd grown up in, no. That place was a mausoleum of old assumptions and tighter smiles. I meant the apartment I had quietly purchased 3 years ago just outside Boston, tucked in a neighborhood where no one knew my parents' names, only mine. The walls were bare when I moved in intentionally. I wanted space. Not just physical, but emotional. Space to breathe without history pressing in from every side. Space to choose what I brought with me. Now, those walls held stories. A framed citation from a NATO training mission. A shadow box with a patch from my first deployment. A photo of my unit under a blazing desert sun, every face exhausted, dirt-streaked, grinning. And, tucked just above the bookshelf, a small watercolor I'd painted one sleepless night during officer school, a lone tree growing sideways out of a cliff face, roots twisted and fierce, reaching into stone. The metaphor had not been subtle, but it had been honest. I poured myself a coffee and let the steam blur the glass of the living room window. Outside, the world moved on, unaware of how much had shifted inside me in recent days. That was always the way of things, life insisting on motion, even when the soul begged for pause. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from my brother. "Mom's making your favorite roast tonight. You should come by." They're trying. Trying. That word. It made me tired just reading it. Because what he didn't understand, what none of them ever seemed to grasp, was that trying now wasn't the same as caring then. You don't patch a ship after it's already sunk and call it a rescue. I didn't respond. Instead, I walked down the hall to my bedroom and opened the closet. At the back, behind old coats and pressed uniforms, hung a garment bag I hadn't unzipped in years. Inside was the dress I wore the last time I tried to impress them. It had been for my cousin's wedding. I'd taken leave, driven through a storm, smiled through every comparison they threw at me, her fiancé's job, her perfect gown, her Ivy League degree. When someone finally asked what I'd been up to, I said quietly, just finished a joint NATO exercise overseas. They blinked, unimpressed. "Still doing that army thing?" one of them said, swirling a glass of wine. I zipped the garment bag shut. That dress didn't belong in my life anymore. I slipped it off the hanger, folded it neatly, and placed it into a donation box. One of many. Because it wasn't just old clothes I was letting go of. It was everything that made me small to fit into their world. The next morning, I found myself at the edge of the lake. Not by design, my feet had simply carried me there. It was a place I hadn't visited in years, tucked behind the woods on the south end of town. I used to ride my bike there as a teenager, sometimes just to escape the walls of our home, where even silence had an agenda. This place was different. It didn't demand answers or performances. It just existed. Still. Watching. Offering its quiet to anyone brave enough to meet it with honesty. I took off my boots, sat on the cold stone at the edge of the water, and let my toes graze the surface. A breeze stirred the reeds, and with it, the memories came, uninvited but not unwelcome. I remembered being 16 and furious, after my father had told me that military school was a phase, something I'd grow out of. I'd come here and thrown rocks into the water until my arm ached. Then I'd cried, not because I didn't believe in myself, but because I'd wanted someone else to believe in me too. But no one had come looking. Not then. Not ever. Until now. My phone vibrated on the stone beside me. Again. Another missed call. My mother this time. Her persistence was a new character in the play of our relationship, and it didn't suit her. She had always been the queen of avoidance, skirting emotion with recipes and folded laundry. This time, she left a voicemail. Her voice cracked at the edges, like porcelain chipped, but not yet shattered. "Olivia, it's your mother. I didn't realize. I mean, we didn't know how much this meant to you. We're proud. We are. Please come for dinner." She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't say she was wrong. She said she didn't know. But it wasn't that they didn't know. It was that they didn't care enough to ask. There's a difference. I stared at the lake, thinking how many times I'd come here with questions no one answered. But maybe I'd been asking the wrong ones. Maybe the point was never to make them see me. Maybe the point was to stop needing that altogether. I stood, brushed the dirt from my uniform pants, and picked up my boots. There was one more thing I needed to do before I could move forward. One last goodbye. I hadn't planned to visit the house. But sometimes closure isn't planned, it's summoned. The driveway was the same. Cracked pavement, the garden beds half-tended, the porch swing creaking faintly in the breeze. The house itself looked smaller than I remembered, like time had folded in around it. Or maybe I'd just outgrown it in more ways than one. I didn't knock. I didn't have to. My father opened the door as if he'd been watching, waiting for the sound of footsteps on gravel. He looked older than I remembered, grayer at the temples, lines carved deeper across his brow. For a moment, I saw the man who had once lifted me onto his shoulders at the 4th of July fair, before his silence became sharper than any word he'd spoken. "Olivia," he said, his voice low. I nodded. He stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. I did. But this time, I walked in not as a daughter hoping to be seen, but as a woman who no longer needed permission to exist. The living room was just as I'd left it years ago. Family photos on the wall, all carefully curated. Smiling faces, posed victories. The version of us they wanted the world to believe. My presence there had always felt like an accessory to someone else's narrative. My mother appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her eyes red but dry. "We made your favorite," she offered gently. "Lamb stew. Just like when you were little." I looked at the table, set for 4. My brother was there too, his eyes flicking toward mine, uncertain. We sat. They tried. They asked questions about my work, my unit, the promotion. They complimented my uniform. They offered clumsy praise. They didn't understand the difference between admiration and reconciliation, but I let them speak. Because sometimes, grace isn't about who deserves it. It's about who needs it. I answered politely. I smiled when appropriate. I even shared a story from my last deployment. But the whole time, I could feel the old echoes circling, memories of dinners where I had tried to speak and been cut off, dreams I'd shared that were dismissed with a chuckle and a refilled wine glass. This wasn't a return. It was a ritual. One I had to complete to make peace with what was. After dessert, my father cleared his throat. The room shifted. "I underestimated you," he said. We both did. My mother nodded. We were wrong. It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever get. And that was enough. I stood, gathered my coat, and stepped toward the door. "Thank you for dinner," I said. Not "I love you." Not "I'll be back soon." Just, "Thank you." As I walked down the steps, I felt lighter. Not because they had changed, but because I had. Their house could no longer contain me. I was too full of my own story now. I didn't look back home. I stood in the doorway of my apartment, letting the quiet settle around me like a second skin. It felt different now. This silence wasn't heavy. It was whole, intentional, mine. I walked to the far room, the one I'd never quite finished decorating. It had started as an office, then morphed into a storage space, a catch-all for things I wasn't ready to sort through. A holding pen for unfinished business. Tonight, I opened the boxes. Inside were journals, old photos, certificates, even a worn duffel bag from basic training that still smelled faintly of dust and adrenaline. I found the medal from my first commendation, awarded after a rescue mission that barely made it into the official report. I'd kept it in a drawer for years, ashamed of how little my family seemed to care. Now, I pinned it to the new corkboard on the wall. One by one, I began assembling a gallery not of who I had tried to be for them, but of who I had become for myself. Maps from past deployments. Letters from soldiers I'd mentored. A snapshot of me standing beside a makeshift field hospital, sweat-soaked and smiling. This room was no longer a spare. It was a sanctuary. By midnight, I was sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by fragments of my past that finally made sense when viewed as a whole. I wasn't broken. I was forged. There's a difference. I pulled out one last envelope. Inside was a letter I'd written to my younger self on my 25th birthday when the loneliness had felt sharpest, and I'd wondered if any of it would be worth it. I read it aloud. "Dear Olivia, I know you're tired. I know you're questioning whether any of this will ever make a difference. But hold the line. Keep showing up. Not for them, for you. One day, you'll look back and realize the girl they tried to silence became a woman they couldn't ignore. I exhaled, slowly, folded the letter, placed it in the center of the new desk, and, for the first time in years, I felt at home. Not because of where I was, but because I'd finally claimed who I'd become. 2 weeks later, the envelope arrived, thick, cream-colored, heavy in the hand. The kind of stationery used for weddings, galas, or events where the guest list mattered more than the cause. It was from the Parker Foundation, my family's legacy charity. Founded by my great-grandfather, run for decades by my father and his siblings, paraded around Boston like a symbol of virtue when in truth, it was a monument to appearances. I opened it carefully. Inside, an invitation. You are cordially invited to the annual Parker Legacy Dinner, honoring excellence in leadership and community service. My name was printed just beneath the list of honorees. Colonel Olivia Carter. It was the first time I had ever been included. Truly included. Not as a +1, not as a name misspelled at the kids' table, but as a recipient. As someone worthy of recognition. And not because they had suddenly seen me, but because the world had. They had no choice now. I sat with it for a while, fingers tracing the embossed lettering. My instinct was to say no, to toss it aside like all the other empty gestures. But then I thought of that little girl on the playground, notebook in hand, wondering if anyone would ever see her. This wasn't about them anymore. It was about her. She deserved to be in that room. I RSVP'd yes. But on my terms, I didn't tell anyone I was attending. Not my parents. Not my brother. Not the cousins who used to whisper behind my back at family reunions, comparing GPAs and internships and designer heels. I didn't go to make a statement. I went to take up space. The night of the event, I wore a tailored black dress, not a uniform, not armor, just elegance with an edge. I pinned my rank insignia to the inside of my clutch, not for them to see, but for me to hold, like a talisman. When I walked into the ballroom, heads turned. Conversations paused. There was a murmur, the sound of old narratives unraveling. Olivia Carter. Colonel. Honoree. I walked past the table where my parents sat, their eyes wide, mouths caught in mid-sentence. My mother reached for her wine glass like it might explain something. My father opened his mouth, but no words came. I nodded once. Not cruelly, just clearly. Then I moved on. To the head table. To my seat. To the place I had carved out for myself not by blood, but by battle. And the moment I sat down, I felt it. The silence. But this time, it wasn't absence. It was awe. The ceremony moved with the predictable rhythm of all such events, string quartets, clinking glasses, speeches that skimmed the surface of greatness without ever touching its roots. They saved the honorees for last. As the MC began reading my citation, a hush spread through the room. For exceptional service, strategic innovation, and trailblazing leadership as the youngest female colonel in her unit's history. I stood as my name was called. But I didn't rush to the stage. I walked slowly, deliberately, with each step silencing a piece of old shame still echoing in the back of my mind. I thought of every family dinner where my words were drowned out. Every cousin who smirked when I said I'd joined the military. Every time I was asked to keep it down or let someone else talk. Now, the only sound was applause. But this applause didn't sting. It didn't feel performative or polite. It felt earned. I reached the podium, took the crystal plaque from the foundation president, my Uncle William, and looked him in the eye. He offered a tight smile, the kind that asked for peace but didn't understand the cost. I didn't return it. Instead, I turned to the microphone. My journey to the stage wasn't paved in praise, I began. It wasn't built on a foundation of encouragement or approval. It was built quietly, through nights of doubt and days of relentless effort. I paused. My family taught me many things. Resilience, self-reliance, silence. But most of all, They taught me to listen to a voice they could never hear. I looked toward the crowd. And I'm grateful for that voice. Because she carried me here. There was no standing ovation. Just that deep, bone-true stillness that follows when a room realizes it's been seen through. I stepped down without waiting for validation. At my table, an older woman touched my hand gently. "I have a granddaughter," she whispered. "You gave me hope for her tonight." I smiled. She understood. The rest of the evening blurred into soft music and clinking glassware. My parents didn't approach me, not right away. I think they were still trying to decide whether this was redemption or reckoning, but I didn't wait for them. I slipped out early, plaque in hand, the cool night air wrapping around me like a quiet promise. It was done. Not the journey, no, that was still unfolding. But the part where I needed them to see me? That chapter had closed. And I had written the final line. Back home, the plaque found its place in the new sanctuary I'd made, a quiet corner with soft light and shelves lined with the fragments of a life reclaimed. It sat beside the NATO pin and the faded journal from my early days, the one with coffee stains and field mud still ground into the spine. Every item on that shelf had a story, and none of them required anyone else's approval to be meaningful. That night, I pulled out a fresh piece of paper. And I wrote. But this time, not to myself. Not to my parents. To a girl I'd never met. Dear you. I don't know your name. Maybe it's Rachel or Mia or something you'll grow into one day. But I know who you are. You're the one sitting quietly at the edge of the table, hearing more than anyone realizes. You're the one who dreams in full color while the world tries to paint you gray. You're the one who keeps showing up, even when no one claps. I see you. I was you. Here's what I want you to know. You don't have to earn their love by being smaller. You don't have to twist yourself into a version they can understand. Some people only measure worth in mirrors that reflect themselves. That doesn't mean you're unworthy. It just means you're not their reflection. Keep going anyway. Not to prove them wrong, but to prove yourself right. With everything I am. Oh! I folded the letter gently, sealed it, and slid it into a drawer of other letters I'd begun writing in moments like these, letters not for response, but for release. Some nights, I wondered what would have happened if I'd quit. If I had listened to the voice of doubt instead of the whisper of resilience. But those were fleeting thoughts now, like ghosts knocking at windows already boarded up. I wasn't haunted anymore. I was home. And the woman in the mirror, the one they never saw coming, smiled back with a quiet that roared louder than applause. It was a rainy Sunday afternoon when the knock came. I wasn't expecting anyone. I wasn't dressed for guests. I was barefoot, hair damp from the shower, wrapped in the kind of quiet contentment that used to feel foreign in my skin. But the knock was steady. Not frantic. Not hesitant. Just certain. I opened the door. And there he was. My father. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets, rain pooling in the creases of his collar, eyes darker than I remembered. Time had softened his shoulders, but something in his gaze remained stubborn, sharp around the edges. "May I come in?" he asked, and I hesitated, not from fear, but from the gravity of the moment. How many times had I imagined this scene? How many versions had played out in the theater of my mind? I stepped aside. He didn't sit right away. Just stood in the center of the room, taking it all in. The framed citations. The photographs. The warmth. The evidence of a life he hadn't asked about. "This place suits you," he said, finally. "It's mine," I replied. He nodded, slowly. "I won't stay long. He cleared his throat, as if the words had grown rust. "I needed to say something. Without your mother. Without the ceremony. Just me." I leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Go ahead." "I was wrong," he said. "About you. About what matters." There was no dramatic pause. No reaching for tears. Just a simple, hard-earned sentence. I spent my whole life chasing titles I thought meant something. Doctor. Chair. CEO. I thought those things defined success. I thought they defined us. He looked around the room again. But I've never built anything that looked like this. That felt like this. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small. A photograph. Worn, creased at the corners. It was of me at 16. Dressed in fatigues. First day of boot camp. I hadn't known he took it. I looked serious, eyes fierce with something just beginning to rise. I kept this, he said. Even when I didn't understand it. Silence stretched between us like a drawbridge, waiting to fall. I don't expect forgiveness, he added. But I wanted you to know I see it now. Who you are. What you've done. And I'm proud. I took the photo, fingers trembling slightly as I traced the edges. I didn't cry. Not because it didn't matter. But because I'd already shed the tears. This wasn't closure. It was confirmation. The final piece of a puzzle I'd already completed. I'm not doing this for you, I said gently. I know. He turned to leave, but paused at the door. You were always stronger than me. And then he was gone. No dramatic exit. No backward glance. Just the echo of a truth that had taken a lifetime to speak. After he left, I sat with that photograph for a long time. My 16-year-old self stared back at me with a storm in her eyes, a mixture of fear, hope, and raw defiance. She hadn't known then what she'd be asked to endure. What she would have to become. She just knew she couldn't stay small. I pinned the photo to the wall of my sanctuary, right between my officer's commission and the letter to my younger self. A quiet tribute to the girl who walked into the fire without knowing if she'd survive it. That evening, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, which, in its own way, was more powerful. Because the hardest battles aren't always loud. Some are fought in the mind, in the heart, in the silence, after someone finally says, I'm proud of you, too many years too late. And even then, you have to decide, what do you do with that? I didn't reach out to my mother. I didn't call my brother. I didn't send a message to the group chat that had sat dormant since the reunion. Instead, I went for a walk. It was dusk, the sky bruised with purple and orange, the kind of beauty you miss when you're too busy trying to be seen. I passed the little bookstore on the corner, the cafe where the barista always remembers my order, the park bench where I once sat and mapped out my 5-year plan on the back of a receipt. This was my life. Built quietly, loved fiercely, held together not by anyone's approval, but by my own hands. Back home, I opened the last moving box, one I'd left untouched for years. Inside were old birthday cards, a few relics from high school, and a sealed envelope in my mother's handwriting. Dated 5 years ago. I'd never opened it. Until now. Inside, a letter. Olivia. I don't always know how to talk to you. You're so strong, and I sometimes feel like you don't need us. But maybe that's just what I've told myself to avoid the truth, that I didn't know how to love someone who didn't need me in the ways I was used to. I was wrong about many things. I don't know if you'll forgive me, but I hope you'll understand. I was scared. Of your strength. Of your independence. Of what it said about my own fears. You've always been more than I dared to dream for you. Love, Mom. I folded the letter, not with trembling hands, but with reverent ones. It didn't change the past, but it did soften something. Sometimes, apologies come late. Sometimes, they come quietly. But sometimes, they come just in time. Weeks passed. Winter crept in slow and heavy, blanketing the city in a hush that mirrored my mood. Not melancholy, more like restoration. Like my bones, once rattled by the chill of being unseen, had finally warmed to the fire of self-truth. It was during one of these still mornings, coffee in hand, slippers soft against the hardwood, that the email arrived. Subject line, Leadership Conference, Women Who Redefined Power. It was from the Regional Military Academy. They wanted me as a keynote speaker. Not for tactics. Not for strategy. But for story. Your story. The words made me pause. Because for so long, I had fought to separate myself from that story. To outgrow it. To bury the parts that bruised. Now, they were asking me to illuminate it. I said yes. The event was held in a grand hall, all glass and stone and echoes. The audience was filled with cadets, officers, and civilians. Rows of young women with bright eyes and sharper dreams. I didn't use notes. I didn't need them. I spoke of failure, not the absence of achievement, but the feeling of being told you weren't enough, even when you had given everything. I spoke of silence, not the kind that comforts, but the kind that cages. And I spoke of forgiveness, not for their sake, but for mine. Halfway through, I spotted a familiar face in the crowd. My cousin Stephanie. The same cousin who, years ago, had once laughed politely when I shared my ambitions, then turned away to talk about Harvard law and Supreme Court clerkships. Now she was leaning forward, eyes wide, fingers wrapped tightly around a notepad. She wasn't laughing anymore. After the speech, cadets came up, one by one. They shook my hand, asked questions, shared their own fragments of struggle. But Stephanie waited until the crowd thinned. When she approached, her voice was low. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I thought I knew what strength looked like. Turns out, I just hadn't seen yours clearly." I didn't respond right away. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted her to feel the pause, the weight of what had been left unsaid for too long. "Thank you," I said finally. "It means more than you know." She smiled, tentative. Would you have coffee sometime? I'd like to learn from you." I didn't promise anything. I didn't gush. I just nodded. Because sometimes evolution comes not in shouts, but in softened eyes and the courage to say, I was wrong. And sometimes the greatest revenge isn't vengeance at all. It's becoming undeniable. A month later, I hosted my own gathering. Nothing grand, just a dinner for 12. Former teammates, a few officers from my unit, 2 mentors, and 3 women I'd met at the leadership conference. No wine-stained linens. No family name on the invitations. No comparison games or whispers behind crystal glasses. Just real people. Real stories. Real light. I cooked. I cleaned. I chose the music and set the table myself. Soft eucalyptus garlands, mismatched dishes I'd collected from antique shops, and place cards written in my own careful hand. No caterer. No pretense. Only presence. As guests began to arrive, laughter spilled into the hallway like a language I finally understood. We talked about deployments and divorces, about resilience and the cost of being the first, or the only, or the one who never got to fall apart because someone always had to hold the line. And somewhere between the salad and the soup, I realized this was family. Not by blood, by bond. The woman across from me, Anna, a trauma nurse who'd served in Afghanistan, lifted her glass. To the ones who were told they were too much, she said, her voice a mix of strength and sorrow. And became exactly what was needed. We toasted. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was sitting at someone else's table. This one was mine. After dessert, we drifted into the living room. Someone played the old upright piano I'd inherited from a friend who said, "You need more beauty around you." Another guest, Jenna, recited a poem she'd written about women who walk through fire barefoot and leave footprints behind. It wasn't polished. It wasn't perfect. It was powerful. As the night wound down, Anna touched my arm. "You know what this is, right?" she asked. "It's restoration. You didn't just survive the war, Olivia. You came home and built peace." I didn't know what to say, so I just hugged her, long and real. When the last guest left, I stood in the doorway for a while, watching her tail lights disappear down the street. Then I went back inside and sat at the head of the table, alone, but never lonely, because I had become the home I'd always longed for. The holidays arrived with their usual glitter and weight. Every store window blinked in festive lights. Every street corner hummed with the same carols, the same cheer, and yet, in my chest, there was a steadiness that years ago might have felt like grief, but now felt like a boundary. This year, I didn't go home. There was no Parker family table for me. No overcooked roast. No uncomfortable small talk dressed up as tradition. There was only an email, sent by my mother on Christmas Eve. "We'll miss you tomorrow. Your father says hi. We made your favorite rosemary potatoes. Love, Mom." No apology. No acknowledgement of the silence that spanned decades. Just a placeholder sentiment. A message left in a room I no longer occupied. I didn't reply. Instead, I made my own rosemary potatoes. I set a table for two, myself and a dear friend from my first deployment, Celia, who had lost her mother the previous year and hadn't planned to do anything either. We wore pajamas, drank mulled wine, and watched old movies. We didn't toast to family. We toasted to endurance. To women who became their own safe place. To those who carved peace out of the debris of neglect. That night, after Celia left, I lit a candle and sat by the window. Snow began to fall, soft and slow, and the world looked untouched for a moment. And I thought not of the family that couldn't love me the way I needed, but of the girl who kept loving herself anyway. Who didn't let bitterness rot her bones. Who turned absence into sanctuary. It was never about them, was it? It was about what I did with the silence they left behind. And in that silence, I had built something holy. The new year arrived with little fanfare. No resolutions, no glittering parties. Just quiet intention. I had stopped trying to become someone for others. Now, I focused on becoming more of who I already was. One morning, as I walked into the command center, a young lieutenant approached me nervous, fidgeting with the edge of her notebook. "Ma'am," she began, I wanted to say, I read your speech. The one from the conference. I paused, unsure of where this was going. "My mom sent it to me," she continued. Said it reminded her of how I used to be before the world taught me to apologize for being different. I blinked, caught between emotion and command posture. "I'm not apologizing anymore," she said, straightening. "Thank you." It was such a small moment. But it unraveled something deep. Because while my family might never fully understand what I'd done, there were women who did. Who saw their own story in mine. Who used it as a lantern in their own fog. And that mattered more than any belated, "I'm proud of you." That day, I walked past the wall of commendations in our unit's main hallway. Bronze plaques, polished medals, names etched in stillness. My name was now among them, added quietly, but not unnoticed. "Colonel Carter, would you like to say a few words?" one of the sergeants asked. I didn't hesitate. I stood before the wall and looked not at my plaque, but at the faces around me. "I didn't get here because I followed someone else's plan," I said. "I got here because I listened to a voice most people told me to ignore, my own." I paused. And if you take anything from that, let it be this. You don't need a room to say you belong. Sometimes you walk in, claim your space, and the room rearranges itself. There was no applause this time. Just nods. Real ones. The kind you feel in your bones. Afterward, one of the older officers pulled me aside. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said. "He spoke of you once, said you had fire no one could put out." I smiled. He wasn't wrong. Spring arrived with its slow unraveling, the frost retreating, the days stretching, the air carrying newness like a quiet promise. And with it came an invitation. Not mailed, not official. Verbal. Reluctant. From my mother. "We're having a small gathering," she said on the phone, her voice clipped with caution. "Just family. We'd like you to come." It wasn't the words that struck me, it was the tone. No longer commanding. No longer entitled. Just careful. A reaching hand. I said I'd think about it. Not to be cruel. But because I owed it to myself to consider, was this a step forward? Or another attempt to reclaim a version of me that no longer existed? I decided to go. Not to make peace with them. But to prove something to the girl who once stood in that hallway, clutching her diary, heart full of ache, wondering if she was invisible. I arrived in uniform. Not to impress. To remind. The house was almost the same, though somehow smaller. Or maybe I was simply bigger now, too full of her own truth to shrink into the old corners. My brother greeted me at the door. "Hey," he said. Just that. But it wasn't cold. Inside, the walls still held the same pictures: my brother's diplomas, my parents' wedding photo, family vacations. But now, nestled between them, was a new frame. My promotion ceremony. Me in full dress. Standing with pride. I stopped in front of it, silent. "You look like you," my father said, stepping beside me. It was, perhaps, the most honest thing he'd ever said. Dinner was polite. Not warm, not hostile. A truce of sorts. No questions that poked. No compliments that felt transactional. Just a slow, awkward rhythm of people trying to learn each other again. After dessert, my mother handed me something. A thin box. Inside was the Rhode Island School of Design acceptance letter I'd once tucked into my diary. Preserved. Unfolded. "I found it in your old room," she said. "Didn't know you'd kept it." I looked at her. Not angry. Just clear. "I did," I replied. "Because it mattered." She nodded, eyes glossy but not breaking. "I'm sorry we didn't see it then." This time, the apology didn't come wrapped in excuses. It came bare. I left shortly after. Not because I was unwelcome, but because I had reclaimed what I came for. My place in the story. Not as the forgotten daughter, but as the woman who came back on her own terms. That night, after I left their house, I didn't drive straight home. I parked a few blocks away from where our old elementary school used to stand, long since demolished and replaced with condos that all looked the same, glass boxes with clean lines and no memory. But I remembered. I remembered the swing set rusted at the joints, where I'd pump my legs hard just to feel like I could fly away. I remembered the cracked blacktop where I always got picked last for teams, until I stopped waiting and just wandered the edges, drawing chalk battle plans that no one cared to ask about. There was no plaque here. No tribute. No proof of the quiet revolutions that happened in a little girl's chest when she decided to stop asking for permission to be whole. And yet I saw her, still. The girl who kept showing up. Who carried her books like armor. Who didn't understand why she couldn't make them love her, but kept trying anyway. I stood at the edge of the sidewalk and closed my eyes. For a moment, I let the world fall away. And I whispered something I wish she'd heard sooner. You were never the problem. Not for dreaming too big. Not for asking too much. Not for being too quiet or too loud or too different. You were a seed planted in the wrong soil. And still, you grew. That's the kind of strength they don't put in textbooks or give medals for. The kind that takes root in the dark and grows anyway. I drove home with the windows cracked open, spring air tangling in my hair, the city lights blurred like brushstrokes. When I got inside, I walked straight to the mirror in my hallway. I looked at myself, not to assess, not to fix, but to see. Really see. No camouflage. No badge. Just the woman who walked through fire and named herself worthy when no one else would. She didn't look invincible. She looked real. And that was more powerful than any illusion of perfection they ever tried to offer me. A week later, an envelope arrived without a return address. Inside, a single sheet of lined paper. The handwriting was delicate, deliberate, each loop and stroke a whisper. Colonel Carter. I don't know you, but I heard you speak last month. My daughter was with me. She's 13. She's not like the other girls at her school. Too bookish, too bold, too much of something they don't understand. She cried in the car on the way home. Not because she was sad. Because, for the first time, she saw a version of herself that had made it through. You gave her hope. And you gave me hope too. Thank you. For surviving. For staying visible. For becoming someone other people can point to and say, see, that's what's possible. Gratefully. A mother you've never met. I held the letter in both hands, careful not to crease it, like it was sacred. Because in a way it was. This was the recognition that mattered. Not the kind given with applause or formality, but the kind that grew roots. That changed the shape of someone's tomorrow. I thought back to my own mother. How different my life might have been if I'd received a letter like this at 13. How many things might have bloomed sooner. But then I caught myself. Because despite the absence, Despite the late apologies and silence masquerading as stability, I had made it. And now I was being used as proof by others. The scar becomes a map. The pain becomes a torch. That night, I framed the letter and placed it on the shelf beneath the medal they hadn't clapped for, beside the journal that held my teenage defiance. A shrine to becoming. A promise kept. The next morning, I wrote a new letter. This time, not for myself. Not for my family. For her. Dear young one, you don't have to twist yourself into something smaller to be accepted. You don't have to fold your edges to fit inside someone else's idea of who you should be. Stay loud if you're loud. Stay quiet if you're quiet. Be bold. Be strange. Be exactly what you are. The world may not see it yet, but you are a revolution in the making. Love. Someone who sees you now.